The Mayan civilization was located in southern Mexico and Central America. The civilization was organized into city-states, and there was often fighting between them. There is very little trade because the civilization was agricultural based. They made many agricultural advances, but they did not domesticate animals. Religion was very important to the Mayan culture. They built large ceremonial temples on which they ritualistically made human sacrifices to their many gods. The sacrifices were usually prisoners of war, criminals, or old slaves. They also created elaborate calendars that incorporated agriculture and religion. They also had their own complex language. The Mayan civilization came to a mysterious end in 900 CE, and no one really knows the cause of their demise. The Trans-Saharan trade route ran through Africa's most desolate area. As it was a perilous and waterless journey, the merchants had to pick their beasts of burden wisely. The camel could store and go without water for a long period of time. The camel saddle was developed so that you didn't have to sit on the hump. When the Roman Empire was in control, they traded salt and palm oil. When the Muslim people took it over, they traded gold, wheat, olives, animals, and people. Indian Ocean trade. At this point, the Mediterranean was the biggest trading on the water so far, but the Indian Ocean gave them a run for their money. Trading down there wasn't easy. It was a longer journey than in the Mediterranean Sea. People usually just stayed in the places that they were going. This made the culture down there way more diverse and mixed. People sold different items there, thus eliminating the competition for the markets. In order to get back to where they started from, they had to make ships with pivoting lateen sails so that they could catch and direct the monsoon winds. The early items that were traded were porcelain and silk from China, spices from India, and ivory from Africa. The Silk Road. This route was an important link between China and urban parts of Mesopotamia. During the Roman Empire, the Silk Road was extended to reach the Mediterranean, so this route linked the two major empires in the world at this time, Rome and China. Herders and nomads were often trade facilitators that moved in between these two places, on horseback, with bows and arrows, and they were very agile. Mongols were steppe nomads. Later there were caravans all along the road to buy and sell goods. The nomads moving along this route were usually the suppliers of the animals that would transport goods down the route. Obviously, the most important and most popular commodity being traded on this route was silk from China. The Silk Road traded and spread religion, technology, but not just goods, but diseases as well. Feudalism, Japan versus Western Europe. Although many people consider feudalism a European invention, the Japanese also had a form of the structure. They exhibited some key commonalities. Both Japan and Europe had landowning and non-landowning castes during the Middle Ages. But the daimyo had much more power in Japan than they ever had in France, Britain, or any other European country. While the European nobility received land in exchange for their military service, the samurai did not join a land-owning hierarchy. Instead, they were given an independent income from their local lord based upon what that lord's land produced. In contrast, European knights usually had their own serfs to work the lands the knights received from their lord. While a Japanese samurai might have had servants, these servants did not work the land the way they would have done in Europe. Mongol rule, Russia versus China. Russia was conquered by the Golden Horde, the western part of the Mongolian civilization. The Mongols made the Russians pay heavy tax tributes. These were collected by Russian collectors. The collectors jacked up the prices so much that they sucked all the money out of the country. This put them so far behind on an international scale that it takes them many years to industrialize. It basically broke the country in two. Comparatively, the Chinese got the better end of the deal. They were ruled by Kublai Khan, and not the Golden Horde. Khan dismissed all Confucian scholars, stopped foot-binding, prevented marriages between the Mongols and the Chinese, and didn't let them learn the Mongolian language. This helped China retain their cultural identity, which could have been the downfall of the Mongols as it ended badly for them. The spread of Islam and Buddhism. The core of the Islamic expansion was Medina, Saudi Arabia. The Prophet Muhammad fled there after persecution in Mecca. The Umayyad Caliphate really jump-started the spread of Islam as they controlled the Middle East, some of Spain, and northern Africa. It did not spread to the rest of Europe, though, because the Umayyad were stopped at the Battle of Tours in Paris. The Abbasid then took control of the Caliphate. Bodh Gaya was where the Buddha reached nirvana. He gave everything up in his life to become a hermit and achieve the status of a higher truth. The spread of Buddhism was really warranted by the Silk Road. It spread through northern China and India like wildfire. Hinduism still dominated as the primary religion, but people converted regularly. Acceptance of Islam, Africa versus Europe. The difference in attitudes of Africans and Europeans on the topic of Islam is significant. In Europe, Charles Martel stopped Muslim advance towards Paris so that the Islamic Empire never flourished in Europe beyond parts of Spain and southern Italy. There was always hostility between the European and the Islamic worlds. Africa's reaction, however, was much different. Africans came into contact with Muslims through trade. To facilitate political and economic relationships, the ruling elites and merchant classes of the Eastern African kingdoms converted to Islam, but maintained many of their own cultural traditions. Eventually, Islam had spread through most of East Africa and made its way through the West. During this time period, China somehow managed to maintain external influence in the Indian Ocean with the junks. They continued their trade relationships with Japan while forging new trade relationships with Korea and Vietnam. China was also a big supplier of porcelain. During this time, however, the Europeans were mainly focused on the trade around the Mediterranean and were constantly trading similar items, which increased the competition and often caused people to get into conflicts.